So for context, SCAG is the metropolitan planning organization for six Southern California counties: Imperial, Los Angeles, Orange, Riverside, San Bernardino, and Ventura counties. And across those six counties, it serves 191 cities, an area covering more than 38,000 square miles, and nearly 19 million people. Within the SCAG region, there are 16 federally recognized tribes, almost 40,000 people living on tribal land, and over 500,000 residents who identify as American Indian or Alaska Native. And then SCAG also has 7 policy seats in its governance structure representing tribal communities. The reason they care about data, they develop a variety of data-related products that affect tribes and Native people in their region. Long-range regional transportation plans, transportation improvement quality programs, regional housing needs allocations, a portion of the South Coast Air Quality Management Plan. And so economic data and analysis are important ingredients to many of the planning and research efforts that SCAG undertakes. In particular, informing their annual regional economic outlooks and other analyses that they do at the nexus of transportation and economic growth. And then I think for them, even more importantly, so folks on the call, I think there are going to be a lot of things that folks on this call know, but I talk about more generally, but I'll name them anyway, right? So the relationship between the federal government, and I think to a lesser degree states and tribes, is really well defined. It's defined through laws and court rulings, the trust and treaty obligation. But less attention has been directed to the relationship between regional government organizations and Native communities. But tribes have really important roles in the direction of regional organizations. And also, regional organizations have a really important role to play in matters that affect tribes and their economic development. Things like long-range transportation and land use planning, environmental quality management, and a variety of other areas, public health, that affect tribal governments and tribal governance. And so in this regard, I think it's really important that there's more focus, especially in a moment of federal disengagement, on how tribes and regional organizations can have effective partnerships. And then at Brookings, so we're Brookings Metro place-based think tank. We frequently develop data products. My work on tribal communities made me really interested in engaging in this project. And so we really had 3 goals as part of this work. The first is we wanted to identify the data needs in federal and state data for tribes and Native Americans in the SCAG region. Second, we combined interviews with tribes and other regional stakeholders with our own research to explore ideas for how states and regions can better engage with tribes to fill data gaps. And then third, and you'll see some of this in the presentation, we'll put together a set of ideas for actions on how to advance new approaches for data collection and ownership. And I'll also say regional tribal partnerships that center tribes in tribal sovereignty. And just to level set, this report in our presentation today focuses on the 6-county SCAG region that I mentioned. A lot of our report material is centered on that region and the tribes situated there, just because that was the focus. But I think many of the challenges that we've identified and the ideas for action that we surface really have both statewide and national relevance. So the next couple of slides overview the main sections of the report. The first thing we do is to lay out for readers who may not have a background in data or tribal data needs about the main problems as we see them that are affecting data about tribes and Native Americans. We in the report identify 5 major challenges, which I'll go through in more detail over the next couple of slides. The first is the first challenge that we identify is that sample sizes for Native Americans are often too small, which affects the quality of many data sets about tribes and Native American people. Again, I think folks on the call are going to notice this, or are going to know most of this, but I'll just provide some context that we talk about in the report. So the National Congress of American Indians has described this trend as creating an asterisk nation, because an asterisk is often used in data displays about Native Americans rather than a data point. Small sample sizes means that the numbers measuring the same indicator about Native Americans often vary really significantly across different data sets. And margins of error for tribes and Native people are often significantly larger within data sets than they are for other groups. And then, of course, there's a challenge that some data doesn't get published at all for Native people due to risk of exposing personally identifiable information. So to illustrate this, here on the left, in the report, we compare the variance across different census data sets for Native Americans in the US population as a whole. So just to illustrate, across 3 of the most popular census data products, the decennial census, the 1-year American Community Survey, and the 5-year American Community Survey, there's about a 1% variance for the US population as a whole. But for Native people across those 3 data sets, there's a 24% variance. And again, you see that same story in California with over 20% variance for Native Americans in the state across these 3 data sets. So the order of magnitude of variance across different data products for the same data point is about 25 times higher for Native people than it is for the US population as a whole. And then looking at data quality and availability on the tribal level. Here on the right, there are 16 federally recognized tribes in the SCAG region, and none of them have a 1-year ACS data estimate available for their population or land. Of the 16 tribes, 3 have margins of error that exceed their population counts entirely in demographic data, and 2 have no population data available at all. So again, these are sovereign governments, and they're trying to govern, their lands and populations with data that is either non-existent or that is so bad as to have, sample sizes larger than the actual data point. I think our view is that this level of variance would be considered unacceptable for any other level of government in the US. Our second challenge that we identify is the relative remoteness and non-contiguous geography of tribal reservations makes data collection and aggregation more difficult for tribes and Native people. This problem manifests in 2 ways. Statistical surveys tend to undercount Native American populations, particularly those on tribal land. And second, because reservations have unique geographic patterns, it makes it more difficult to align many data sets with tribal lands. So here, and this is pulled from the report, we show the pathway of the Southern Pacific Railroad in its extension to LA. Doing so led to the breakup of multiple reservations within the SCAG region, the checkerboarding pattern that you see in multiple tribes in the region. And today that influences the quality of data on reservations in the region. It makes it harder to collect and aggregate data in a way that works for tribal land. The third challenge we identify is that many data sets treat Native Americans as just a race, reflecting misunderstandings of Native identity and tribal governance. Again, I think folks on this call and in this group know this, but unique among demographic groups in the US, Native American identity is considered both a racial identity and a political classification. But most data sets collect and classify data on Native Americans as just one of multiple racial groups, rather than a separate designation reflecting the political nature of Native American identity. And as we write in the report, this creates 3 major problems for data about Native Americans. First, many data sets don't report data by tribe, making it significantly less helpful for Native nations. Second, the federal government defines American Indians and Alaska Natives as any people having origins in any of the original peoples of North, Central, and South America, including Central America. That definition means that a large portion of Native Americans in many data sets are actually from countries outside the US, further muddling that racial and political distinction. And then third, on the graphic on the left here on the slide shows nearly 90% of Native Americans in California identify as either multiracial or Hispanic, and so are counted not as American Indian or Alaska Native in most data sets, but instead as part of either the 2 or more races or the Hispanic category. So this makes demographic data on Native Americans in the state substantially less representative of the Native population as a whole. And then in addition, as you can see on the right in the slide, tribal communities indigenous to Southern California make up just a small portion of the region's total Native American population. And this is true throughout the state. This impacts tribal governance because it makes it more difficult for tribes and tribal leaders to disaggregate data for their own uses, and for local tribes, in federal and state data sources. The fourth challenge we identify in the report is that data sets are often designed without tribal input, and data sets don't always reflect tribal needs or interests. Because most federal and state surveys are based on the requirements of laws and agency regulations at those levels of government, the needs of tribal governments have historically not been prioritized when developing statistical surveys. So to include a couple examples that we have in the report, while other levels of government rely on tax revenue to fund government operations, taxes are frequently not an option for tribes, many of which have small populations, a significant number of low-income citizens, and are generally trying to maintain competitiveness with off-reservation communities. So instead, many tribes operate tribally owned enterprises that bring in both economic growth and revenue to the tribe. But these enterprises don't fit neatly into existing data sets. Are they government operations or are they private companies? There's not a great analog in non-native communities. In other cases, tribes may want to measure indicators that other levels of government just aren't interested in. Things like indigenous language proficiency, which can be hugely important to getting a sense of tribal cultural well-being, but probably isn't of big interest to states and federal governments. So this means that the data that federal and state statistical agencies collect often doesn't represent the highest priority needs of tribal governments. And so I include a couple pictures here on the slide. Some tribes have taken the initiative to improve their own data. On the left is a non-federally recognized Fernandeño-Tataviam tribe based in Los Angeles County. This is a picture of its tribal climate resilience plan, which the tribe informed in part through its own data collection. And then the tribe, again, despite not being federally recognized, also runs its own tribal census. And then there are efforts underway at the federal and state levels to identify how existing data can be made more relevant for tribes, or how tribal data can be utilized in federal and state data sets. So for example, on the right here, the Census Bureau has a couple ongoing initiatives aimed at improving access to tribal data. One is by repackaging existing statistics and data sets across a variety of different tribal and native nation boundaries. The second is they recently entered into an MOU with the Osage Nation to leverage Osage census data to validate census data about tribes, especially in eastern Oklahoma. So, the picture all the way on the right here is a signing ceremony for that agreement. But as we write on the report, these types of efforts they're scattershot, they're nascent, and they really need more resources to scale up in any sort of sustained way. And then the last challenge we identified is that some federal, state, and local data remains inaccessible to tribes. So federal, state, and local government agencies, as well as nonprofit organizations, and even for-profit companies collect data through surveys or other processes, and they store and control that data for their own use. However, because tribes disproportionately, at a rate higher than other levels of government, need to rely on outside data, data about tribal lands and citizens is often controlled by these non-tribal entities. And currently, much of that data is not public, which means that tribes can't access it. So while the federal government and the state of California have some processes in place for tribes to access some data, some confidential data in limited settings, as we write on the report, we often think these efforts don't go far enough. So one example of these efforts on the federal level, the US government has taken steps to make some personally identifiable federal data more accessible to certain groups, including tribes. This was part of the Foundations for Evidence-Based Policymaking Act of 2018, ironically signed into law by Donald Trump. This law calls on federal agencies to create a standard application process for entities that includes tribal governments to apply for access to confidential federal microdata. Individual entities approved through this process receive a designation called special sworn status. But as we write in the report, while this law provides a legal pathway for tribes to, in theory, access some suppressed data, it nevertheless leaves several significant barriers. In addition to just being generally difficult to access and being spatially limited, you often have to go to a federal data center to access this data. More recently, the Trump administration has begun removing or making inaccessible a variety of federal data sets, that it has deemed in conflict with executive orders that the administration has issued. So the slide, the picture on the slide right now is a screenshot of ResearchData.gov, which is the web portal for accessing data for entities with special sworn status. And so as you can see here at the top, there's a growing number of data sets that are no longer accessible through that system. And that number seems to be growing over time. So those are the 5 challenges we identified. To add further context to these challenges, we hosted a series of roundtables and qualitative discussions with tribal leaders, state and local officials, experts on Native American data, and other stakeholders in the SCAG region. In total, we spoke with over 60 individuals across 30 interviews or listening sessions. And we summarized what we heard in those discussions into 6 insights about the state of Native American data in the SCAG region. So in effect, this is what regional stakeholders are saying about the state of Native American data in Southern California. So the first insight is that tribes engage with data in a variety of different ways and have a strong interest in data that more accurately measures their populations and lands. During our conversations, nearly all tribal stakeholders could name multiple use cases for data that they leveraged across different government functions. And tribal leaders were nearly unanimous that they'd like to see more done by federal and state partners to ensure government data sources more accurately represented them. Second, while tribes have a wide array of different economic conditions, tribal leaders really saw data as a key enabler for accessing federal, state, and regional funding to meet critical economic development needs. Again, because tribes don't have a tax base, grant-based funding is a significant portion of their government budgets. So a core emphasis of tribal stakeholders in our conversations was that data sets that don't allow them to break out population subgroups, that use out-of-date data or lagging data, or that don't have relevant geographies, harmed their ability to successfully compete for state, federal, and other grants. Third, tribes told us that a lack of understanding of tribal sovereignty by non-native entities contributes to misunderstanding about them as governing entities. Multiple tribal leaders said that they felt that they were sometimes treated not as government partners, but rather as nonprofit organizations or even private sector, their words, developers, like property developers. As to how this relates to data, we heard that this lack of understanding of tribal sovereignty leads to less data transparency and less collaboration between tribal governments and other government agencies. Tribal leaders said that they often at times felt like an afterthought when non-native government entities created data products. So again, really validating that challenge of tribes not being prioritized in federal and state data. And they said that the lack of understanding of tribal sovereignty made it harder for them to access non-public data. Fourth, the sample size, geographic, and other challenges we outlined earlier inhibit the development of new data products by and for Native American communities. When we asked tribal leaders if they could provide us with examples of data tools they had built using publicly available data, none of the tribal leaders we spoke with could give us an example. They did say there were non-public data sets that they felt could provide more accurate estimates of tribal demographics than they already had. Fifth, tribes vary significantly in their data capacity, priorities, and desire for autonomy versus regional or state involvement in data creation. So this won't be surprising to you, but different tribes have different interests and different needs when it comes to data. Some tribes had robust in-house analytics departments, while others had relatively little capacity to engage in data work given their more pressing needs. Tribes also varied in their opinions of how involved state and regional agencies should be in data development. Some tribal leaders wanted to see more proactive state and regional government agency involvement in improving tribal data, while others wanted more autonomy and recognition to do their own data collection with little external support or oversight. And then finally, many current government processes and structures struggle to support tribal data capacity. Because tribal data needs and data capacity vary significantly, non-native governmental organizations need both a dedicated plan and robust and sustained outreach to ensure that tribal data needs are truly understood and can be met by regional and I'd say state actors. But what we found from our discussions is there's currently wide variation in how non-native government agencies engage with tribes, and that can inhibit the ability of even well-intentioned state, regional, and local government officials to adequately support tribal data needs. So that was a lot. In response to the challenges we've identified, we've developed a 4-part agenda of ideas for action to help support native data needs in Southern California and beyond. Within each of these topic areas, we've developed 2 sets of recommendations. First is we have regional ideas for action, which are actions that regional government organizations like SCAG or others could implement. We couple those with a set of state and federal ideas for action, which are actions to smooth the pathway for and amplify the impact of regional efforts. And again, the idea here is that while these are Southern California centered, we think they have broad applicability across many regions and states. The 4 topic areas that we recommend action across. First is implementing data strategies for interacting with tribes and tribal data. The second is investing in tribal data capacity. The third is supporting tribal sovereignty and self-determination. And then the 4th is making government data more accurate and relevant to Indigenous peoples. So Lori, I'll look to you. I can go through and quickly highlight 1 or 2 specific actions from each topic and then open this up to the discussion, or I can pause.
That'd be great, Robert.
Yeah. You want me to kind of go through a couple?
Yes, please.
Great. So the first idea for action centers on implementing data strategies to set a foundation for ethical, meaningful, and mutually beneficial engagement with tribes and native communities around data. We think these types of data strategies could also encompass other relevant areas of formal and informal partnership building between tribes and regional entities to support mutual trust. So in particular here, we think both a regional and state level Indigenous data strategy could provide momentum for policy action. There are a variety of international best practices from Canada, New Zealand, and Australia that the SCAG region in the state of California could draw from if it wants to move forward with developing a regional or state Indigenous data strategy. There are also national Native organizations like the U.S. Indigenous Data Sovereignty Network that are doing work already to this effect. In the report, we also note that regional entities could partner with regional Native organizations to ensure that any strategy is guided by the priorities and expectations of local tribes. So in Southern California, this could include entities like the Tribal Alliance of Sovereign Indian Nations and the Southern California Tribal Chairmen's Association. As a next set of ideas, we explore how regional, state, and federal agencies can look to deploy resources to develop tribes' internal data capacity. So on the regional level, organizations can help develop new data programs and tools in partnerships with tribes. This would look different across different tribes and regions. In some cases, it may be helping tribes get subscriptions to private data sets. In other cases, it may be more hands-on technical assistance, such as supporting tribes as they develop culturally relevant data best practices. For tribes interested in more robust support, one idea we heard was for regional organizations to work with tribes on a voluntary basis to transform census data and other federal data and microdata into tribally relevant indicators to support tribal decision-making. This was actually already underway as part of a partnership between the Quetzal tribe and Northern Arizona University and the University Center there. On the state level, there's an obvious need for the state legislature to provide funding for tribal data needs. In addition, we think that more state agencies could provide technical backbones and expertise to support the development of new data tools. Some agencies and offices are already working with tribes on data-related projects and topics. I'm sure folks, on this call know this even better than I do, right? One example we cite in the report is the California State Water Resources Control Board's Tribal Water Data Initiative, which has worked with tribes to develop an online mapping platform with information on water resources on tribal lands that has been informed by the needs of local tribal leaders. Next, we put forward a set of ideas to support tribal sovereignty and self-determination through data. Here, because most public data is collected and controlled by the federal government and states, most of the latitude for action is at that level. So there's only so much that regional organizations can do on this topic, but one step that regions could take would be to allow tribes to provide their own data for accessing regional grants and funding. In the report, we note that some grant programs have funding requirements than any application materials, including data provided for grants, be made available to the public through federal or state Freedom of Information Acts. So in instances where that type of policy is in effect, we talk about how regional organizations could explore ways to protect tribal data when it's in the interest of tribes, taking steps like allowing tribes to self-certify that they meet grant requirements or automatically designating tribes as eligible entities for certain types of grants. On the state and federal level, there's more latitude for action. I think more that needs to be done to support tribal sovereignty and self-determination around data. On the state level, California could look at developing a state level equivalent to the federal government's special sworn status designation to access state confidential microdata. There's already some protected data from the California Department of Healthcare Services accessible for research and public health purposes. So that could be one avenue to explore expanding and using as a basis for this type of state designation. And then in the report, we write about developing secure online portals for tribal governments to more easily access data about their lands and their citizens that is currently held by state and federal agencies. In the report, we specifically cite the example of this being done already on the national level in New Zealand. Their initiative called Te Wata, where Stats New Zealand worked with Maori tribal leaders to create a protected online portal that is accessible to Maori tribes and Maori tribal government officials. And what it does is it contains data needed for internal tribal governance. It also has a publicly available platform where the iwi or New Zealand tribal nations are able to choose what of their data sets are available for public consumption, what isn't. I could see something like that being implemented in the US, but if there's a state that could lead on doing this, it would absolutely be California. And then finally, we explore ideas to make government data more representative of and relevant to Indigenous peoples. On the regional level, one fairly straightforward idea would be for regional and local agencies to implement the 2024 federal guidance that was issued for improving the practices around aggregating race and ethnicity data. It was called Statistical Policy Directive 15 or SPD 15. So as I mentioned earlier, nearly 9 out of every 10 census-defined Native American people in California is classified as either 2 or more races or Hispanic in government data. So that means that many data sets report data on Native Americans are only reporting data for about 10% of the total Native population in California. These new standards issued by the federal government have guidance about how agencies can report more robust data around Native people, but they haven't yet been rolled out in most local or state settings, and even most federal settings at this point. So we think that regional agencies could play a role in helping local governments in their region understand how to implement these new standards to best improve data around Native people. And then on the state level, I think policymakers should explore how to provide tribes themselves with a bigger role in surveying their own residents in supporting relevant data sets. So these partnerships already exist on the federal level. Tribes play an important role in supporting the enumeration for the decennial census, for example. I also mentioned the Fernandinho Tataviam tribal census in the MOU, between the Census Bureau and the Osage Nation. So this type of work is already underway, especially on the federal level. I think that state policymakers could explore how to more formally support this type of work, such as by taking steps like providing funding to tribes to conduct tribal surveys designed by the tribe and that meet tribal needs, but that could maybe include information to inform relevant state data sets. Any data that tribes provided the state could be done on a strictly voluntary basis with MOUs to govern the protection of data and tribal data sovereignty. So those are some of the key themes and ideas for action contained in our report. Like I said, in terms of release timing, we're hoping to have this out in early to mid-August. So this is really a preview of what you're going to see in the full report. And Lori, I'll let you know once we have a confirmed date and you can share it with the group. This is my contact info, my email for those that want to stay in touch. And in addition to answering any questions you have, I'd also love to get your thoughts on who we should make sure sees this report and how we can get into the hands of the right stakeholders. So Katapatanamu, thank you for having me today and really looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you so
I'll
much,
stop
Robert.
sharing my screen here.
This is a really great report. I really liked all the things you went into, and that it really is seen more from a tribal lens than we usually see these kind of government reports. I think that if the state and federal people just read this, they'll learn an enormous amount that they didn't know. The number of people that still say, what do the tribes think? It kind of blows my mind. So, do people have questions for Robert?
Of course I do. I always have questions. This is fantastic. Thank you so much, Robert. And you may have covered this. I'm sorry if I wasn't paying attention when you did, but does the report list the tribes that you interacted with to inform this report?
Yeah, we do. So there are 16 tribes in the SCAG region, 16 federally recognized. Depending on how you count, there are 4 to 5 non-federally recognized tribes. We were able to do interviews with about half of them. The other half either didn't respond or weren't interested in speaking with us. So we visited 6 reservations, met with, I believe, 8 federally recognized tribes and 1 non-federally recognized tribe in the region. And they're all listed in full in the report. But because it was in partnership with SCAG, our one limitation was they wanted us to focus only on tribes in the SCAG region, which is why we spoke, for example, with Isabel, but we weren't engaging with a lot of tribes in San Diego County, for example. But we do mention some of the initiatives going on there in the report.
Yeah, we already have our own ag down here. We have sand ag.
Yes, yeah, and we talk a bit about the MOU between, I think it's the Southern California Tribal Chairmen's Association and SANDAG and some of the work and funding that has happened out of that.
Well, so my thinking here is that this is a model for other places to follow, not just in California, but of course I'm in California, so that's where I tend to focus. So what do you think are the possibilities for this being pushed out as something that other associations, whether it's associations of governments or the state of California, to follow?
Yeah, I think most promising is on the regional level. SCAG has kind of already informally committed to doing a fair number of the ideas that we talked about, obviously funding contingent, but I think they want to do quite a few of these. And they've told us that just in our capacity of working with them. And they obviously read this really closely as we were putting together and as we've iterated and finalized the report text. And so a lot of what we've put in there, they think is not just feasible for themselves, but also for other regional government entities that have, NPOs and others that have kind of any sort of like baseline capacity. So I think there's some real opportunity to do this on the regional level. I think SCAG will probably move forward with many of these ideas. And I think the question of whether it can happen elsewhere is one of just, awareness and political will. Like, are regions thinking about this? Is this top of mind still? Are they not scared off from doing this type of work in the current climate? And that to me is the big factor. And I think it's an awareness question too. The challenge that we found in the SCAG region is unless you're working with Native people a lot of the time, you're not thinking about Native people a lot of the time, right? And so that it's not that they don't care. It's just it's not number one on their radar. And so I think that that's going to be a challenge, basically in any region that is, not majority or plurality Native. And I think in a lot of places in California, there's opportunity for this, but that might be the number one challenge. On the state level, it's a bit more up in the air because we haven't interfaced with the Newsom administration as much. We have briefed the Office of Tribal Affairs on the report. We've shared this with them. They have their own priorities, and they're working hard on a variety of different initiatives right now. I think that they view their primary constraint is we have statutory and funding constraints on what we can do. And unless the state legislature wants to give us a big pot of new funding to do this type of stuff, we can't really commit to doing anything yet. So that was a bit of the message that we got on the state level. Doesn't really surprise me, but that was in part why we wrote a lot of our state level recommendations aimed at the state legislature rather than necessarily at the Office of Tribal Affairs.
Who paid for this?
SCAG, which was funded by the state, which in turn was funded by the federal government through the American Rescue Plan Act. And so we got it in like just under the wire before all this money like turned into a pumpkin.
Yeah, and then my last thing, at least for now, is what conversations, if any, did you have with the tribes about topics revolving around things like data sovereignty?
Yeah, quite a few. And when you read the report, you'll see that in almost every policy recommendation, that's kind of a theme throughout. And owning and holding onto the data needs to be centralized within tribes. We've also had multiple tribal leaders review this and provide feedback. And the reception. I've done a lot of work in Indian country. I've never had harsher critics than other Native people reading my work. So I was like, ready to kind of duck and cover a little bit when we sent out the draft, but it was overall well received by the tribal leaders in the region who read it, and so we were enthused by that.
Good. I've had that same, and for you as a tribal citizen at Mashpee, at least you can have that that situatedness of being a tribal citizen yourself.
Yeah.
But even
I don't know if it always helps.
Yeah, I would say even when you are, it's you're Mashpee. That's not how we do things here
exactly,
in
exactly.
Fernandino lands, and so
exactly.
There's a lot of different points of view when it comes to that stuff. But I can't wait to see the whole thing. Thank you so much for coming today to tell us about it.
Yeah, and I'd love to share it once we have the final text copy edited, an early draft, and then I can let you all know when it's published for real.
Terrific.
Do we have any other questions for Robert?
I wanted to it's a general sort of question. We on occasion have wondered whether we could help with tribal data, not just the stuff we get to the state, but because we have in our unit, which is Community Health Statistics Unit, we have a bunch of EPIs and we can answer data requests. And I just want to alert people to this. If any, because we work with all kinds of agencies, and sometimes it's been Indian Health, but it's usually been like the one I did was related to car crash data in parts of the county. So that was very specialized and stuff. And I've talked to Tribal Epicenter once or twice in the past that we can provide some data support. And I've wondered whether that is something that our tribal community would be interested in. If they could, I was sort of envisioning someone has a data set, they de-identify it, and they say, tell us the following diseases of interest, and we could do that coding, because that's quite labor intensive to look at ICD-10 coding and do that, but we do that all the time. We have, hundreds of data sets coded for that. So we could easily adapt it, send it back, and then it could be de-identified and maybe rates calculated on the other end. And we don't even need to know. We don't know anything that we need to know. I mean, it's just like, you want to know how many people have heart disease and were in the ED, or how many people were, in inpatient treatment or died. We can give you those counts coded for this disease. I'm wondering about these sort of small, helpful lifts that someone who's working with secondary data could assist with, if that would be of interest. We also push out a dashboard based on the data we can get from the state, either from Verbis, which is the death data, or the morbidity data from the Department of Public Health. I never get any feedback on it, but we keep pushing it out, but I think we also have the California Health Interview Survey data that we look at. And it seems like there's a big piece missing. Is there some way we could tie in more specific native data to their benefit? And we don't, like I said, we don't need to really even know about it, but we don't charge, right? And so we work all across the board on lots and lots of things that are particular. There's no charge for it. You want a map? We do a map. You want to report on car crashes in the, among women who are DUI? Yeah, we can do that. So my question is, if you know anybody that you want to direct our way, we could possibly help in that way, because at least, it's not going to be a charge.
Yeah,
And
that's go ahead, sorry.
I was gonna say, and the data can be identified even more than what we do with the public health data. But we don't need to know male female. If it's assisted, and if somebody wanted us to calculate rates and blah blah blah, and gave us something, here's male female, here's whatever. Yeah, we can do that. We can even provide a selection of denominators if that's useful in a data machine friendly kind of way, if that's at all helpful.
That's a great comment. I'll just note a couple things. First, on the discussion on CHIS, the California Health Information Survey, we note in the report that every 10 years, CHIS doesn't oversample of Native Americans. And we just say in the report, they should just do that every year. And the state legislature should fund that every year.
Every year, yeah, because we get a lot of these small pops that, we have the same thing.
Yeah.
One thing I wanted to drop in was, I don't know whether somebody in this group right now sent this to me, the link to me, but this is the American Medical Association Journal of Ethics, and it's an article on how should epidemiologists respond to data genocide. And it's really interesting, and has some of the same things you taught on. It's a little bit more pointed.
Yeah, that's great.
Sure.
Abigail and Lenise, Abigail Hawk and Lenise Baker both were among the interviews that we did for our report. I've worked with Abigail on a couple other things, so they informed this work. Look, I can't directly comment on San Diego County because we didn't work there for this piece, but I can provide some thoughts just from the work that we did in the 6 counties we were in. The first reaction I have to what you're talking about, Isabel, is that tribes may not know that that's up for offer. And I think that could be a pretty big barrier. So I think like that comes back to the communication thing and the trust building. And I think what you'll find is, even when you do outreach, interest is going to vary across tribes. The tribes that are most plugged in on data may not actually be interested because they're like, we're already doing this stuff, like just leave us alone. And then the tribes that may benefit from this may not even like know where to start. And so they may not like want to go forward with this because they're like, we kind of don't know what we're getting into. We don't know that we trust everyone involved here. So I think like that may be a barrier. The other two I'll quickly say, I think the data ownership issue can be a real stickler here. Like tribes are really reluctant to turn over their data to non-native governments for obvious reasons. And so that's where I think like developing these pilot MOUs could be a really groundbreaking effort here. Like this is the type of stuff that is replicable within the county in non-health, non-epidemiology areas. It's also things that are replicable in other regions, right? So it might be interesting if you can kind of see, like, if you go down that path, identifying things like the key clauses in the census Osage agreements that made both sides comfortable with this type of work. That could be one path that you could go down to kind of come to the table with something to say, like, look, we know you're probably pretty preemptively concerned about this topic and this, you know, this issue of data ownership and who has final control. Here's what we're going to do to protect that and make sure that we're respecting your sovereignty.
Yeah.
And I think you know this, but like that's kind of what I took away from our work.
Oh yeah, I believe it. That's you want to protect your data. We wrestle with that quite a bit with others as well, but it's very particular to tribal data for sure. It's a big flashpoint, hot point, of course. But if you know anyone who needs help just to learn stuff or need guidance on how to code stuff, we could probably help with that. Even if we didn't get the data, we might be able to be of assistance. But all right, I'll look for more places to sort of reach out. See what we can
Thank you so much, Isabel. And thanks, Robert. This was, I love your report. I thought it was really good. I had a great time reading it.
Thank you.
And thank you guys all for your time. We'll see you September 10th for our next meeting. Thank you all.
Great being with you. Thanks so much.
Keep fighting the good fight, everybody. See you soon.